right, everyone, get ready for a wild ride because today we are diving deep into the life of Red Dillard Morrison. This guy's story, I mean, you sent over his wiki page, and it's like something straight out of Hollywood,
Yeah.
but way more than just another gangster flick.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a guy the feds labeled, get this, the most dangerous man in the country.
Yeah, the most dangerous man.
But he's also like this beloved figure in Harlem's jazz world.
I know, right? It's crazy. Total paradox.
Total paradox.
So, how does someone go from, small-time hustling to basically being the guy everyone's scared of?
Right.
That's what we're going to figure out today. We'll track Morrison's whole journey, starting from his early days all the way to, the peak of his infamy, notoriety, whatever you want to call it.
Notoriety, yeah.
And trust me, there are going to be some seriously wild twists and turns along the way.
Oh, yeah. No doubt about it.
Yeah.
Especially those early years, you can practically see the ambition, like burning in this guy.
Yeah.
Arrives in New York from Alabama, 1937, just a teenager. Tries those, typical jobs to help out his family. But it's pretty obvious pretty quickly that he's not going to be satisfied with the ordinary.
It's not even just that he, turns to crime. It's how he does it, right?
Exactly.
This guy's not messing around with petty stuff. He goes straight for, the big fish, robbing craps players, those numbers runners, which, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, that was basically the illegal lottery back then.
Exactly. It shows he was thinking strategically from the get-go.
Yeah.
Even his early crimes were, super audacious. Robs a Woolworths, right? And then immediately after hits up a check-cashing shop.
I know. It's wild.
Most people would, lay low after one big score, but Morrison, he's just getting started.
Right. And then there's that insane story about the ambush.
Oh,
He
yeah.
gets shot in the leg, right?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of, dealing with the wound, he chases the gunmen back to their car.
It's insane.
What kind of toughness is that?
Well, that incident became legendary in Harlem. And it's not just about, physical toughness.
Yeah.
It's about sending a message.
Yeah.
This is the kind of guy you're dealing with.
Right.
Don't even think about crossing him. It's this pattern we see over and over again with those who rise to power in that world, establishing dominance through, sheer force of will.
And that fear, that definitely played a big part in his rise, right? People were too scared to testify against him. Charges got dropped left and right.
Oh, absolutely. Control through fear.
He was practically untouchable.
Morrison understood that. The power of a reputation, of making sure everyone knew what would happen if they crossed him.
Yeah.
And, that kind of control allowed him to operate with, this freedom that was almost unheard of, especially for a black man in that era.
Yeah, that's true. So he's building this rep, making a name for himself, and that's when he meets Big Joe Richards.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this guy, he's a bit of a mystery, right?
A real enigma. Big Joe. He controlled a massive network, but always from behind the scenes, never out in the open. For Morrison, this was like a masterclass in organized crime.
Oh, yeah.
He learned from the best. He became Big Joe's right-hand man.
Right. But, like we see in so many of these partnerships, things go south.
Yeah, that happens.
Morrison splits from Big Joe, and that's when his ambition goes into overdrive. He decides to get into the heroin trade, and not just any heroin. He goes directly to the source, Lucky Luciano.
Talk about a power move.
Oof.
Luciano was running heroin from Turkey through Sicily into the U.S., a major, major player in the post-war drug scene. For Morrison to buy from him directly, it launched him into the big leagues.
That's cutting out, all the middlemen, right?
Absolutely.
But it's not just drugs, is it? This guy, he's got his hands in everything, pimping, throwing these legendary parties, living the high life, and his name is spreading everywhere, for better or worse.
Yeah, for better or worse, he was a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
A true kingpin. But, that kind of notoriety, it always attracts attention.
Right.
And for Morrison, that attention was about to change everything.
Okay, so we were saying how Morrison's name was everywhere, good and bad. That kind of spotlight, though, that's got to make you a target, right?
You would think, right. But it wasn't rival gangs, wasn't even the local cops who really took Morrison down.
Oh, wow. So who was it then?
It was a federal agent, undercover,
Yeah.
managed to, worm his way into that whole Harlem drug scene.
Whoa. That's going deep undercover. So what happens? They, set him up, a sting operation or something.
Exactly. 1950, nail Morrison on drug trafficking charges, 5 years in federal prison. Big blow to his operation.
5 years, right when you're on top. I bet that hurt more than any rival ever could. What was so important about that Turkish heroin connection, though? Sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It was a big deal.
Hmm.
This is, right after World War II. Global drug trade's in flux. Turkey becomes this major heroin supplier. And guys like Lucky Luciano, they're right there to capitalize.
Yeah.
Morrison getting busted, it wasn't just about him.
Yeah.
It exposed this whole network the authorities were just starting to figure out.
So he's in prison, labeled the most dangerous man. You'd figure that's the end, right? Curtain closes, roll credits.
Yeah, you'd think.
But it's not. And this is where it gets really interesting, because even locked up, Morrison's got this whole other side, this deep connection to the jazz scene.
Yeah, it's one of those things that makes Morrison's story so fascinating. Feds see a ruthless criminal. Jazz community. They see a friend, a patron of the arts, genuine lover of the music.
All right, gotta hear more. What kind of connections are we talking about here? Spill the tea.
Okay, picture this. Billy Eckstine, Sarah Vaughan, two of the biggest names in jazz.
Mm.
They visit Morrison, and get this, perform for him while he's doing time at Otisville.
No way. Really?
Yeah.
That's wild. Speaks volumes about the guy, you know? What kind of pull he had. Even in prison, these legendary musicians are coming to him.
Doesn't stop there. After he's released in '55, Morrison's a regular at all the big clubs. Birdland, Savoy, Minton's, hanging out with Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk.
Wow, imagine those conversations in those smoky clubs. Did anyone ever, encourage him to go straight, use those connections, become a manager or something?
It's funny. There were times, thought about getting into real estate, even considered opening a dry cleaning business. But for Morrison, that pull back to the underworld, it was strong. And tragically, it was a personal loss that kind of sealed his fate.
Oh, yeah, the tragedy. Things get dark here, don't they?
They do. His wife, only 33 years old, dies suddenly. Allergic reaction to penicillin, just devastating. Morrison turns to cocaine, spirals into grief. And yeah, the music offered some solace, but it wasn't enough to keep him from those old habits.
So the most dangerous man, the guy who scared everyone, it's heartbreak that really brings him down. Not a rival, not the law.
It's a reminder, isn't it? Even the toughest guys, they're still human underneath it all.
Yeah. And that vulnerability, that's what leads to his downfall. More shootouts, bar fights, than another drug deal orchestrated by, guess who, another undercover federal agent. 10 years this time.
10 years.
Man, what a life. Feels like he almost had a chance to break free, but that pull, those demons.
It's that age-old question, isn't it? Nature versus nurture. How much control do we really have? Morrison's life is like a case study in that.
Yeah. Even back in prison, that connection to the jazz world, it's still there.
It is. Eckstein and Vaughan, they still visit. And when Sonny Payne, the drummer who played with Count Basie and Harry James, passes away, Morrison sends $1,000 from prison to help with the funeral.
Wow. These jazz legends, sticking by a convicted felon, makes you wonder what it was about him, you know? What drew people in despite everything?
He was a man of contradictions, that's for sure. Ruthless one minute, incredibly generous the next. There was something about him, a charisma, that went beyond his past.
It's fascinating. Do we know if he ever, expressed regret for the choices he made, the path he took?
Sadly, no. The historical record's pretty silent on his inner thoughts. What we do know is that after his release in '74, he goes to Los Angeles and, get this, even pushing 60, gets back into the drug game.
Old habits die hard, I guess. But even out in LA, he's still supporting musicians. That generosity, that tie to the music, it never went away.
It's a testament to his complexity. Here's a guy who lived in the shadows, surrounded by violence, but found something real in the beauty of jazz. It's a reminder that even in the darkest places, that human spark, it can still exist.
That's deep, man. So what ultimately happens to Red Dillard Morrison? Does he find peace?
Well, in '79, another blow. Girlfriend testifies against him, ends up back in prison on drug charges. Feels like that cycle he was trapped in, it finally caught up for good.
Almost Shakespearean, you know? A guy who could have been anything but his choices, his circumstance.
And in the final twist, right? The guy who survives countless shootouts, dangerous situations, ends up succumbing to something completely different. Red Dillard Morrison dies of bladder cancer in prison, 1989. He was 69 years old.
Man, what a story. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of Red Dillard Morrison's life, but it's been a ride. Harlem kingpin, jazz enthusiast. His life was full of contradictions, challenges, and, tragedy.
It's a reminder, history's made up of individuals, each with their own unique experiences. And sometimes those experiences lead to a life that defies easy labels, a life that leaves you with more questions than answers.
That's a great way to put it. We've explored his rise in the Harlem underworld, his notoriety, those surprising connections to jazz. But the true legacy of Red Dillard Morrison, it's complex, a puzzle for anyone fascinated by, the underbelly of American history.
And for you listening, it might make you think, what makes a man dangerous? Is it the choices, the circumstances, or something deeper? What about redemption? Does that play a role in a life like this? Those are questions worth pondering.
Absolutely. Food for thought for sure. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Red Dillard Morrison. It's so easy to just focus on, like, the crazy parts of Morrison's life, the violence, the whole most dangerous man thing. But there's this whole bigger picture we got to consider, too.
Oh, for sure. You can't just look at Morrison without thinking about, like, what's happening around him, right? This is the Depression era, organized crimes exploding, racial tensions are through the roof. It all plays into his story.
Totally. I mean, being a black man in America back then, especially in a place like Harlem, opportunity, danger, it was all kind of mixed up together, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And Morrison, he navigated all that with, like, this crazy mix of ambition, ruthlessness, and, well, you got to admit, he had charisma. Even people who were terrified of him had to respect the guy.
Makes you wonder, what if he'd been born, like, in a different time, different circumstances? Would he have gone down a different path, or was this just, like, his destiny?
That's the question, isn't it? Nature versus nurture. It's a debate people are still having,
Yeah.
How much of who we are is already decided, and how much is, like, influenced by our environment, the hand we're dealt. Morrison's life is almost like an example of that whole struggle.
It's like he was going to be a legend no matter what. Even today, in Harlem, his name still means something. A reminder of this time when gangsters and jazz musicians were hanging out together, and the American dream was this, like, this promise that was right there, but so hard to actually reach.
And that's the power of Morrison's story, I think. It reminds us that history is made up of people, real people, each with their own choices, their own experiences that have a ripple effect. It makes you look past the headlines, makes you think about how complicated human nature really is and how individual choices play into, like, the bigger story of history.
So true. And for everyone listening, thinking about Morrison's life, does it make you question what dangerous really even means? Is it the actions, the circumstances, or something deeper? What about redemption? Does that have a place in a story like this? Lot to think about there for sure.
Absolutely. It's easy to judge when you're on the outside looking in, but when you dive into a life this complex, this full of contradictions, it makes you question your own ideas about good and evil, success and failure.
That's what makes these deep dives so cool, I think. We get past the surface level, past the simple story, and find all this nuance and complexity that makes us think differently about the world, and maybe even ourselves.
Exactly. Because in the end, it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about understanding the forces that shaped a person, the choices they made, and the impact those choices have, even long after they're gone. And who knows, maybe by understanding a life as unusual as Red Dillard Morrison's, we can understand a little bit more about what it means to be human.
Well said. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of Red Dillard Morrison. A life lived on the edge, a man of contradictions, a legend whose story still fascinates and makes us think, even all these years later. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and as always, keep diving deep.